The man known to history as King George IV was born on the 12th of August 1762 at St James's Palace in London. By right of birth, he was born with several noble titles, including Duke of Cornwall and Rothesay and Earl of Carrick. As the eldest son of the reigning King of England, he was also made Prince of Wales 5 days after his birth, a title which had been held by each heir presumptive to the English throne since the beginning of the 14th century. George was named after his father, King George III, King of Britain and Ireland, and Prince Elector of Hanover in northern Germany. George III had ascended to the throne less than 2 years before the birth of Prince George. He was the monarch's eldest child. George's mother was Queen Charlotte of the House of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a middling state in Germany in the 18th century. She was just 17 years old when she married George III in September 1761. There was no major age difference between them, the king being just in his early 20s, and the marriage was an unusually happy one by royal standards. Prince George was the first of 15 children they would have together. They were lucky by 18th century standards in that 13 of these would live into their adult years, and the majority would have long lives. George was born into a contradictory time in British history. On the one hand, the country was about to enter into a period of enormous colonial growth and social and economic development, which would launch this small island nation on the periphery of Europe to become the most powerful nation on earth in the 19th century. A few years before the prince was born, Robert Clive and the English East India Company had begun conquering large parts of India, a process which would continue for decades until the subcontinent was entirely controlled by Britain. India was just one sphere of British expansion. Just a year after George was born, Canada was acquired from France as part of the peace terms of the 7 Years' War, and soon James Cook would be setting out to explore the South Seas as the Royal Navy established new footholds around the world nearly every year. At home in England, technological and economic innovations were being made in the textiles industry in the 1760s that augured the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. However, at the same time, there were many problems facing the nation. Most notably, those in England's oldest colonies in North America were becoming more and more disillusioned with crown rule and heavy taxes, and would soon rebel as a result, while at home there continued to be many social problems, not least English public antipathy towards Roman Catholicism. Soon growing urban poverty would be added to the mix. All of these would form the background to George's life and later reign. Royal children in England for most of the past millennium were placed in a separate household and provided with staff to raise them. Prince George was no different. His governess was Lady Charlotte Finch, a daughter of the Earl of Pomfret, while a wet nurse and several other staff were also employed, including rockers of the cradle during George's infant years. At 4 years old, George was inoculated against smallpox using one of the many experimental vaccines against this deadly early modern disease that were being trialled at the courts of Europe in the second half of the 18th century. By age 5, he was able to write, and his education continued in the years that followed under the guidance of several very well-learned tutors and preceptors, such as Richard Hurd, Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry. the nuances of royal education were peculiar. On the one hand, a prince like George was coddled in most things, yet his father adhered firmly to the contemporary belief in the efficacy of corporal punishment as an aspect of education. Hence, George was physically punished by his tutors when he seemed to not give sufficient care to his studies. As he grew, he clearly revealed himself to be an intelligent child with a keen aptitude for the Greek and Roman classics and an interest in the new sciences of the time. But he had a strong rebellious streak. George soon emerged as a less than ideal heir to the throne. Though he was clearly somewhat intelligent and attuned to what his duties should be as Prince of Wales, George was, by his own admission, quote, rather too fond of wine and women. By his teenage years, he was already carousing around London in a problematic fashion and engaging in trysts with many of the female royal staff, many of whom were rather inconveniently already married. Some of these dalliances became matters of public scandal and created problems for the royal household. In late 1779, when he was still just barely 17 years old, George entered a relationship with a well-known London stage actress by the name of Mary Perdita. Perdita was about 5 years his senior and quickly realized that life as a royal lover would be far more financially attractive than the life of an actress. She quit the stage when George promised to set her up with £20,000 when he came of age. Eventually, after the relationship soured and others had to intervene, Perdita was paid off with a lump sum of £5,000 and a pension of £500 for several years to come. This was just one example of how George emerged as a headstrong carouser in his youth, characteristics which would define him in one form or another for most of his life. George's drinking and affairs soon earned him the reproach of his father. George III was less than impressed by these characteristics in his son, nor were they the only points of criticism. The king also criticized the prince regularly for his failings when it came to his education and, in particular, his attitude towards religion. Similarly, George III did not look favorably on the company which his son kept. Whether it was rakes who encouraged his drinking, and for him to visit the gambling tables of London that had been the undoing of the estates of many noble families in the 18th century, or his friendships with several prominent Whig politicians, notably Charles James Fox, a figure who was persona non grata at the Tory-leaning court of the king on account of his political views, many of which were radical for the time. This is not to suggest that George was not without ability. Many people noted of him that when he was sober he displayed an admirable intellect. The problem was that the more his father seemed to criticize his wayward habits, the more George seemed to indulge them, almost as though he took a pride in his rebelliousness. This was perhaps nothing out of the ordinary in his younger years, but as he aged into his 20s and 30s, he continued his fondness for booze, women, and cards. It placed a strain on the relationship between king and heir, one that was a constant feature of their lives and was never healed. George's difficult relationship with his father was, no doubt, caused in part by the tensions of government in the late 1770s and early 1780s. These were years of political crisis in England, and George III took them very personally. In 1775, the rising tensions in the 13 colonies in North America had boiled over into outright rebellion owing to excessive taxation and non-existent political representation. The following summer, the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia issued a Declaration of Independence decreeing the creation of a United States of America. The war that followed between Britain and the colonials was a close-run thing in 1776, 1777, and 1778, but thereafter the Continental Army gained the upper hand under the leadership of George Washington. Eventually, Britain would lose the war. The king viewed this as a personal attack by his subjects in America against him as their sovereign. Furthermore, it created growing political problems at home in England owing to the king's support for Lord North, who, as Prime Minister between 1770 and 1782, had not just fomented the war, but then had the misfortune to lose it as well. If Prince George's relationship with his father soured during his adolescence and early 20s, it must be viewed against the backdrop of this war, which the king was still troubled by even many years after it ended. The political issues of the era saw the prince desiring to play a greater role in public life in the 1780s. These were all stymied by his continuing personal issues. Two things occurred during these years which ensured that the king was never going to allow George a greater role in public life so long as he continued along the path he was on. The first of these was his debts. In 1783, when he reached his majority at 21 years of age, George was provided with an annual allowance of £50,000 by parliamentary consent. A vast sum of £100,000 per year had been proposed, but had been vetoed by the king, who correctly surmised that the prince would squander it. Along with his revenue from the Duchy of Cornwall, which amounted to about £12,000 per year, this meant he had an income of £62,000. Even so, he managed to spend all of this each year in his 20s and otherwise run up an absolute mountain of debt. How he achieved this was complex. George liked interior decorating and tastefully decorated a large house on Pall Mall. This included sending agents to Qing, China to acquire vases and other expensive items. The stables he was maintaining were costing £30,000 alone every year, half his income. Then there was his drinking and gambling, the latter of which added up, as well as the money he dispensed lavishly on his drinking companions. Incredibly, by the late 1780s, he had accumulated an astonishing debt of over £250,000. This was when George was still in his mid-20s and set the template for the rest of his life. George's idea of budgeting was always to try and only run up a certain amount of debt each year, not to actually live within his means. As bad as George's debts were, another major issue emerged in the mid-1780s. In the spring of 1784, the prince was introduced to Maria Fitzherbert. Her maiden name was Smythe, and she hailed from Shropshire. She was married twice by the age of 22, her first husband having died after falling from a horse not long after they married in 1775, and her second, Thomas Fitzherbert, also dying in 1781 within a few years of their union. When they met 3 years later, George was instantly smitten by her. A year and a half later, on the 15th of December 1785, they married in secret in a ceremony performed in her London residence. This was not a good move on George's part. Firstly, the marriage of an heir to the throne was a matter of state at the time and, quite simply, George was not free to choose his own bride. One could admire his audacity in disobeying these rules were it not for the fact that it was largely pointless. English law at the time stipulated that the marriage of any child of the monarch had to be approved by the reigning king or queen. Therefore, the marriage was legally invalid, and in law, it was nothing more than symbolic. On the other hand, when news of it emerged, it undermined George in two ways. It infuriated his father, and it riled up public opinion against the heir, for Fitzherbert was a Roman Catholic, something which was still a major issue in Protestant Britain by the late 18th century. It also added an extra layer of legal difficulty to the union. Roman Catholics were disbarred from the succession, so had George III been of a mind to legally sanction the marriage, it would have opened up the possibility that Prince George's right to succeed his father would be objected to by Parliament on the basis that his children and heirs might be raised as Catholics. George's fecklessness and complicated love life was particularly worrying for those close to the corridors of power in Westminster, for there were also signs that his father, the king, might not be well. As far back as the 1760s, in the first years of his reign, King George III was identified as being a monarch who was prone to acting in a peculiar manner, becoming agitated over minor things, and acting out of character. Over the years, this evolved into periods of mania, in which he talked rapidly and incessantly, often not making much sense. By the 1780s, these symptoms of what used to be called the madness of King George had become acute, and these episodes were occurring more frequently. On one occasion, George was at dinner with his parents when his father rose from his chair and, seizing George, pushed him into a wall. This was not some violent outburst at his son's general behavior. Instead, he seemed to not be fully aware of what he was doing. The episodes continued in the weeks that followed, with George often uttering obscenities to the royal household staff, swearing and attacking the pages that waited on him, and generally acting completely out of character. They would leave him fully incapacitated for a time in 1788 and early 1789. It is now believed that they were caused by porphyria. This is a disease which leads to an abnormal metabolism of hemoglobin, which then manifests as liver and kidney disease. Over time, it produces mental illness as toxins build up in the sufferer's blood, in essence, poisoning the blood in ways that impact on the brain. While we cannot be certain, it is highly likely that George was suffering from this. In the autumn of 1788, it left the king incapacitated for an extended period of time. With this, all eyes turned to Prince George as the heir to the throne. When the first regency crisis of George III's reign began in 1788, those in charge of the government, notably William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister across most of the 1780s and 1790s, had no idea how long the king might be incapacitated for. Indeed, his condition seemed to worsen in the late autumn, and it continued through the winter. Faced with a crisis of a kind which had not been seen in England since the days of King Henry VI's bouts of catatonia in the mid-15th century, Pitt began consulting with other ministers and Prince George about a way out of the crisis. Together, they began formulating legislation for a regency bill. Through this, it would be declared that the prince would act as regent for his father during his incapacity. The bill would effectively allow Prince George to take on all the powers and responsibilities of the king, for as long as his father was indisposed, whether that would be days, weeks, months, or years. George III would remain as king, but his son, as regent, would be the de facto monarch in all but name. Luckily, before the legislation was ever finalized, and before George could assume the position of regent on an official level, George III recovered in the course of February 1789. It was far from the last such crisis of George's father's long reign, and the son would soon be called upon again to act as regent. The regency crisis of the late 1780s was particularly worrying for British political leaders like William Pitt in more ways than one. Britain did not need a domestic crisis brewing when there were clear indications of trouble ahead on the continent. France was Britain's perennial enemy, one which it had been in conflict with regularly since the 12th century. Consequently, many people in London and England might have looked on with glee in the 1780s as France became mired in an ever-deepening economic and social crisis. However, they would have been less amused when King Louis XVI's efforts to stem the crisis saw a revolution break out in Paris and Versailles in the summer of 1789. The people of England, along with pretty much everyone else in Europe, watched with horror in the months and years that followed as the French Revolution became ever more radical. By the middle of 1792, the situation was so extreme that Austria and Prussia went to war with what soon became the French Republic. Britain followed them to war early in 1793. The French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars that followed would last down to 1815. Britain would be at war with France for approximately 20 out of those 22 years. This would form the backdrop to George's growing efforts to play a greater role in British political life in the 1790s and 1800s, and his regency in the 1810s. The early 1790s saw a continuing standoff between George and his father after the king recovered his health. Some of this focused on the prince's debts, a huge proportion of which were being created as a result of his lavish development of Carlton House as his London residence. This would become a cultivated and artistic statement of Hanoverian culture when it was finished, replete with paintings by some of the great masters of the 17th and 18th centuries. Chinese vases, French furniture, and many other high-end items from Europe and Asia, all tastefully assembled and completed by designers that George paid great sums to bring over to England from the continent. But it cost a fortune. Then, to compound the insult to the treasury, George eloped from London once it was nearing completion to go and live in Brighton on the south coast with Fitzherbert, a move which seemed more designed to spite his parents than anything else, though he was surely getting too old for adolescent petulance. In London, the king worried when news was received that the prince was negotiating a loan from the French government to try and maintain his lifestyle. The public perception of George around this time was at the worst level imaginable. The Times newspaper described him as a hard-drinking, sexually loose individual removed from religious and decent society and constantly surrounded by swearing gamblers, finishing with the apt line that he would, quote, at all times prefer a girl and a bottle to politics and a sermon. This was the low ebb of George's existence. It seems to have been the case that the regency crisis of late 1788 and early 1789 had imbued in him the possibility of finally being given some important role in public life, and that once the opportunity dissipated upon his father's recovery, he doubled down on his rather debauched existence. The public at large were not happy. On one occasion around this time, he was on his way to a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral in London when crowds along the streets of the capital began jeering at his coach. Things were not any better at court, and what especially irked George's father was that the standoff between himself and his son was now seeping into Parliament, where the Tories were standing firm behind the monarch, while the Whigs were presenting themselves as supporters of the prince. This was nothing more than pure opportunism. It was not as though George had much to offer the Whigs policy-wise. The only goal was to curry favour with him in the expectation of a fresh regency crisis down the line if the king's health continued to decline. When it became apparent in the course of the early 1790s that the king would not be falling back into a state of mania, and George's finances continued to cause him ever-growing problems, the prince began to develop a more conciliatory approach. First, he distanced himself from his pseudo-wife, Maria Fitzherbert, and eventually, on the 23rd of June 1794, she was informed that her relationship with George was over. He didn't do this in person, instead writing to her to this effect. He had little choice other than to take this course of action. His debts were now a crippling £600,000 or so, a sum equivalent to about £65 million in today's money, and they could not be resolved without a rapprochement of some kind with his father and mother. Hence, George indicated to them that he would now seek to marry and produce a royal heir in line with his duties. This certainly does not mean, though, that he stopped philandering in general. George would have many further mistresses throughout his life, many of whom were married already, and he clearly sired several illegitimate children, though not as many as have been claimed. One recent survey noted that upwards of 36 children have been suggested at one time or another as being illegitimate children of George's, an improbably high number. Some of these claims were more credible than others. For example, in his twilight years, George claimed he had a son who was serving in the British colonies in the West Indies as a naval officer. Another alleged son was James Ord, who became a Jesuit priest in the United States. If these were George's children, his conduct towards them, as with so much else, was not good. At least, where previous monarchs like Charles II had sired many illegitimate children, he had provided extensively for them, even if they could not succeed him. This didn't happen with George. The gap between the time when Fitzherbert was dismissed by letter and when George became officially engaged was very short. By the end of 1794, the negotiations for him to marry Caroline, a daughter of the Duke of Brunswick and the German aristocracy, were complete. They were first cousins, as her mother, Augusta, was George's aunt, the sister of the king. A marriage of such close consanguinity, though, was not unusual for royal unions in either late medieval or early modern times, and continued to be considered normal into the early 20th century. They were married in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace on the 8th of April 1795. It was an inauspicious beginning. George, who had clearly not responded well on first meeting his future bride, got senselessly drunk the night of the wedding. Instead of consummating the marriage, he appears to have fallen into the fireplace of their marital bedroom. By the following morning, he was conscious enough to take his wife to bed. Almost exactly 9 months to the day thereafter, On the 7th of January 1796, Caroline gave birth to their one and only child, a daughter, whom they named Charlotte, after George's mother. The tumultuous nature of George's personal life was reflected in political and military developments on the continent. When Britain, Austria, Prussia, and others had gone to war with France in 1792 and 1793, they had, initially, looked as though they would overthrow the revolutionary government. They had, for instance, sparked counter-revolutionary revolts around the country, and the British had invaded the south around Marseille and Toulon, ports which they occupied for a time. But eventually, by initiating a program of national conscription of young men to serve in the military, the French were able to turn the tide, and by 1795 were on the offensive, conquering the Low Countries and advancing to the River Rhine in western Germany, while a young commander by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte knocked Austria out of the war after a massively successful campaign in northern Italy. By the end of the 1790s, the British were the only major opponent still at war with France. It would continue this way into the 1800s, even as Bonaparte rose to power as a military dictator and then Emperor of the French, with Austria, Prussia, and Russia intermittently at war with France, and Britain alone remaining a perennial opponent of the growing French domination of the continent. George responded in England to these developments by petitioning to be given a position of some responsibility in the British war effort. His younger brother, Frederick, the Duke of York, had been made a general in 1793 following Britain's entry into the war against France, and saw active combat in the Flanders Campaign of 1794, where a British expeditionary force was trying to prevent the French advance into the Netherlands. In 1795, he was promoted as Commander-in-Chief. George bristled at his brother's promotion and requested to be given a command himself. His father refused. For once, this was not out of disdain for the Prince of Wales's conduct, and was simply owing to concerns that the heir to the throne would be killed in combat. At home, things were not good either. By the time Caroline gave birth to their daughter, George and she were already living apart. A string of mistresses followed, and by 1800, the heir had drifted back to none other than Maria Fitzherbert, the woman he had married back in 1785. Caroline and George would not have any further children, and it soon became clear that George had married her solely for the purposes of having his debts relieved and to put on the appearance of fulfilling his duties as the first in line to the throne. Once an heir of his own was produced, he seems to have considered his marital responsibilities to be fulfilled, and while he did not seek a divorce, there was no real marriage to speak of after a few months. Eventually, this created controversy of another kind. In the course of the 1800s, Caroline began to strike back at her wayward husband. Living in her own household in Montague House at Blackheath, rumours soon began to circulate that she had taken lovers of her own. Such were the gender and sexual politics of the time that while George's behaviour was viewed askance by the public and political community, it was deemed to be totally unacceptable for Caroline to respond by doing the exact same thing. Moreover, this was not the only issue. Caroline's general conduct was eccentric during these years. For instance, in 1802, she adopted a boy called William Austin and took him into Montague House, a peculiar thing for a royal to do at the time. It led some to speculate that Austin was actually her son from an affair. There were also claims by Sir John Douglas and his wife, who lived next to Montague House, that Caroline had sent them obscene and aggressive letters. Alarmed, George decided to order an investigation into Caroline's behaviour and what was going on at Montague House. Although this concluded that Austin was not Caroline's son, there was sufficient evidence of her erratic behaviour and of her sponsoring of political opponents of her husband that her access to their daughter, Princess Charlotte, was severely restricted. Thereafter, she was only allowed a supervised visit once a week. Several years later, once the Napoleonic Wars were drawing to a close, Caroline would elect to leave England altogether and spent much of the 1810s in exile on the continent and visiting North Africa and the Levant. The rumours and hearsay concerning George's estranged wife were just one pressure that the royal family was facing in the 1800s. Another was the deteriorating health of the King and Queen's youngest daughter, Princess Amelia. She eventually died in the early winter of 1810 after a long battle with tuberculosis. This, along with the deteriorating relationship between King and Prince, drove George III into his final bout of severe illness. During Accession Day celebrations on the 25th of October 1810, he appeared agitated and was talking manically, making little sense at times. Then, in the weeks that followed, he slipped away from the world, becoming unintelligible. He would live for another 10 years, but George III was never again of sound mind, spending the remainder of his life secluded, often having elaborate conversations with people who were long dead. The King's final illness ushered in the Regency period, as the 1810s are known. After weeks of deliberation over Christmas and New Year, a Regency Act was passed by Parliament in early February 1811. Through this, Prince George became the Regent and the King in all but name, a dispensation which had first been proposed over 20 years earlier and which was now determined upon. The Regency began in a troubled fashion. Britain was still at war with France, and a fresh conflict with the United States was looming, owing to British insistence on boarding American merchant ships in the Atlantic as part of its naval blockade of France. This would boil over into the War of 1812, a year into the Regency. Elsewhere, George flip-flopped politically in the early years of his time as regent, having earlier been allied with the more liberal Whigs, now instead throwing in his lot with the conservative Tories in 1812. All of this culminated on the 11th of May 1812, when the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, was assassinated in the House of Commons by John Bellingham, a merchant from Liverpool holding a personal grudge against the administration. Though Bellingham had acted alone, the event led to considerable unrest and fears of wider conspiracy. All in all, it was an unstable beginning to the Regency. Surely one of the great successes of the Regency was the successful conclusion of the seemingly never-ending conflict with France. When George became regent in 1810, Napoleon was master of most of Europe, having humiliated Austria and Prussia and stripped them of massive amounts of territory in multiple wars. Only Russia remained a threat to him on the continent, and so, in an effort to reduce them to his rule, Bonaparte invaded Russia in the summer of 1812. The campaign was disastrous. Although he captured Moscow in the late autumn, the Russians refused to surrender. Not predicting this, the French eventually fled back to Poland as the winter set in and their supplies dwindled. With his army in ruins, Europe's powers united and conquered Napoleon's empire in the course of 1813 and early 1814. A first abdication occurred in April 1814, after which he made a second grasp for power in 1815, all to no avail, as the British and Prussians inflicted the final defeat on him at the Battle of Waterloo that summer. In the months that followed, George, as regent, was front and centre in the many official celebrations of the victory. These continued in the years that followed, as commemorations were held into 1816 and 1817, notably the rebranding of the Strand Bridge across the River Thames in London as Waterloo Bridge. The man who would soon become George IV was many things, not all of them good, but historians are generally agreed that as a ruler, he was one of the great patrons of the arts and architecture, certainly to a greater extent than his father. George III was a cultured man himself, though of a more inquisitive nature, and he enjoyed more the work of scientists and engineers who seemed to be devising new machines for the Industrial Revolution every year. Instead, the regent was more interested in patronizing painters, architects, and other designers. Sir Thomas Lawrence, who owed his knighthood to George, was the court painter of the 1810s and 1820s, and many famous portraits of George and other leading royals and aristocrats of the age were painted by him. Joseph Constable and J.M.W. Turner also earned royal commissions during the Regency era, notably Turner's 1819 painting Richmond Hill on the Prince Regent's birthday, which was displayed at Somerset House on completion. There were other developments in architecture and furniture design in the 1810s, though surely the grandest expression of Regency culture and George's patronage of it was the development of Regent's Park in London. In the 1810s, George employed John Nash to begin laying out a grand new park just to the west of King's Cross in the capital. Much of the financing later came from James Burton, yet the Regent's role in commencing the project was considerable, and it formed a part of a wider programme of urban design in this part of London north of the Thames during the 1810s and 1820s, which George could claim credit for. Though George's patronage of the arts can only be partly credited with creating an atmosphere which was conducive to it, the Regency era is remarkable in British culture for the literature of the period. The 1810s witnessed an enormous output from some of England's greatest writers and poets. The Romantic poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge were already producing some of their best work in the 1790s and 1800s, and continued to do so in the 1810s, notably with Coleridge finally publishing Kublai Khan in 1816, though he had started it 20 years earlier. Lord Byron began writing Don Juan at the end of the 1810s, and virtually everything that Percy Bysshe Shelley produced in his short life was published during the Regency period. Jane Austen produced her greatest work in the 1810s. Sense and Sensibility was published in 1811, Pride and Prejudice in 1813, Mansfield Park in 1814, and Emma in 1816. Sir Walter Scott published both Rob Roy and Ivanhoe in the late 1810s. Finally, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published on New Year's Day 1818, offering an early classic of Gothic horror and a critical commentary on the growing technological development and industrialization of England. Few decades have seen such a profusion of literary classics in such a small country. 1817 was a difficult year for George. His and Caroline's marriage had only resulted in one child, Princess Charlotte, who was, as a result, George's heir and second in line to the throne after George. With George III expected to die soon, and George himself being a man well into his 50s, and not exactly in good health, owing to his hedonistic lifestyle over the years, it could be reasonably expected that Charlotte would become queen in the not-too-distant future. The subject of her marriage was a tense one during the Regency period. George wanted her to marry Prince William of Orange, the future King of the Netherlands, but Charlotte, who had very much inherited her father's obstinacy, refused the match and eventually married Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld instead, a German noble who would subsequently become the first King of Belgium in 1831. The union took place in 1816, and Charlotte soon became pregnant. On the 5th of November 1817, she gave birth to a stillborn baby boy. Despite the initial emotional trauma of this, Charlotte seemed to be physically fine. However, late that night, she suddenly became violently ill from postpartum bleeding, and she died in the early hours of the 6th of November. With this, George's only direct legitimate heir was gone, and the succession was once more thrown open to debate, with it now seeming likely that when George himself died, one of his siblings would succeed. George's time as regent drew to a close with one of the most violent episodes in modern English domestic history. While England was a constitutional monarchy, and had been in large part since the civil wars of the 17th century, this was not a democracy in the modern sense. The right to vote was extremely limited, and only men of a particular income or wealth could exercise the franchise. In some poor districts, people were elected as members of Parliament with barely anyone there being qualified to vote for them, a development which gave rise to the concept of rotten boroughs. This, combined with economic difficulties in the late 1810s arising from the Corn Laws and a post-war slump, led to the organisation of a massive political protest at St. Peter's Field in Manchester on the 16th of August 1819. The authorities completely overreacted and ordered a large cavalry charge into the gathered crowd of well over 50,000 people. 18 people were killed and hundreds injured. In the aftermath of it, George foolishly agreed to the Home Secretary, Henry Addington's request that he issue a declaration stating that the Manchester authorities had been correct in how they responded to the protest. The Peterloo massacre foreshadowed a century of unrest amongst the English industrial working class. Old King George III finally died on the 29th of January 1820. He was 81 years of age at the time of his passing. As a consequence, George himself was already 57 years old when he formally ascended as King George IV. Owing to numerous constitutional changes during the previous reign, his formal titles were King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and King of Hanover. Despite having had a decade to prepare for the inevitable change of monarch, George's coronation was not held for another year and a half, only being held at Westminster Abbey on the 19th of July 1821. The large wait may have been because of the extensive planning required to organise what is generally believed to have been the most lavish and expensive royal coronation in English and British history. George wanted the whole affair to exceed the coronation of Napoleon in Paris back in December 1804, a statement that the Emperor of the French had been vanquished during his regency. Important elements of this included the fashioning of a new crown replete with 12,000 diamonds, the holding of a banquet for 2,000 guests, and large celebrations in London. the whole affair cost nearly £250,000, tens of millions of pounds in modern monetary terms. One of the more unusual features of the coronation was that George's wife had not been crowned as Queen Consort alongside him. This was not for want of trying. After years absent on the continent, Caroline had speedily made her way back to England to take up her position as Queen upon the death of King George III. This did not mean that her husband was welcoming of her. On the coronation day, the new king ordered the guards at the entrances to Westminster Abbey to prevent her from entering and attempting to take part in the ceremony. This followed on from efforts in Parliament in 1820 to have Caroline officially sanctioned for having committed adultery during her years in exile. Further controversy was only avoided when Caroline died 3 weeks later on the 7th of August. Her sudden demise and the circumstances in which it took place led inevitably to wagging tongues claiming that she had been poisoned, perhaps on the king's orders. There is no evidence to support this contention, though, and Caroline is understood to have been suffering from cancer, which may have been the true cause of her death at 53 years of age. A peculiar element of the new accession was that George was surprisingly popular for a time. This must have come as a shock to a figure that had been reviled in most circles for many years on account of his dissolute habits and his controversial marriage. However, the London crowd seemed genuinely enthused by the prospect of a new king after the long 60-year reign of George III, and it was noted by many observers and letter writers in the summer of 1821 that George was cheered on his coronation day, while the London crowds jeered Queen Caroline as she was shuttled away from Westminster Abbey, having been refused entry to the ceremony. This popularity extended to Ireland and Scotland. George visited Ireland immediately after the coronation celebrations had ended in England, arriving there in mid-August 1821 and staying for 3 weeks. It was the first visit by an English monarch to Ireland since 1690, and the first time that an English monarch had ever arrived there without an army. A carefully managed set of events in Dublin engendered a lot of support for the new king and established a template for how royal visits to the country would be carried out over the next 90 years. Buoyed by the success of the royal visit, George undertook a similar trip to Scotland a year later. Again, it was the first royal visit to the country in a long time. The last visit there had also been less than auspicious, that being when King Charles II had been there in 1651 during the Third English Civil War, as he tried to wrest control of Britain back from Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarians. George's visit was similarly stage-managed here, with paintings produced afterwards to commemorate it, though David Wilkie's subsequent portrait of George in a Scottish kilt flattered the monarch by omitting the pink tights he had actually worn under his kilt in Edinburgh. Though it is often unremarked on, the time when George IV was king in the 1820s was an important era in the growth of the British Empire. Admittedly, there were not the same kind of acquisitions as had been seen in the second half of the 18th century, when India was largely conquered and Australia was first colonised, nor those of the late 19th century, when Britain seemed to acquire vast territories in Africa every other year. But there were still some notable developments. The enclave where Sir Stamford Raffles had begun developing a port at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula in 1819 transformed into the colony of Singapore during these years, and the northern borders of the British Raj continued to expand, preparing the way for British efforts to move into what are now Pakistan and Afghanistan in mid-century. A number of British colonies in Western Africa around Sierra Leone, Gambia, and Ghana were formed into British West Africa in 1821, which, along with the newly acquired colony in Southern Africa, constituted Britain's first major African colonies. On a perhaps more benign note, the 1820s were crucial in the revitalization of the abolitionist movement in England after something of a hiatus during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The Anti-Slavery Society was established in Britain in 1823. 10 years later, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed by the British Parliament, beginning the process whereby slavery was abolished across the world. George was in his tomb for 3 years when the act was passed, but the years of his kingship were vital in the evolution of it. George's methods as king were typically unorthodox. Kings, by this time, were expected to use a wide secretariat and to work in association with parliamentary staff and government ministers. Instead of doing this, George came to rely to an unusually large degree on Sir William Knighton, a figure who first rose as his physician back around the start of the Regency and then was successively appointed as Auditor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Private Secretary to the King, and Keeper of the Privy Purse. This gave him a virtual monopoly over managing the royal finances in the 1820s. He did a good job in this respect, it must be acknowledged, and by 1825, George was allegedly debt-free for the first time in his adult life. Knighton's hold over the king, though, aroused concern amongst others. Often, George would prevaricate on making important government decisions until he had consulted with him in private, and he seemed to be a constant presence in the mechanics of the royal household. There were also a number of occasions on which Knighton was dispatched on mysterious missions to the continent by his royal patron. Further details about the relationship between the king and his secretary are hard to establish, however. Knighton's widow saw to that, when she committed an awful crime from a historian's perspective and destroyed most of her husband's papers, which included significant tranches of George's own private papers years later. In 1827, political turmoil gripped British politics. In April that year, the long-serving Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, was forced to stand down after 15 years in office when he suffered a stroke. At a time when the monarch still had a substantial say in who the Prime Minister would be, George indicated his support for the Foreign Secretary, George Canning, who duly succeeded despite the greater support for both Sir Robert Peel and Britain's wartime hero, the Duke of Wellington, in Parliament. The appointment caused chaos at Westminster as dozens of ministers and junior ministers refused to serve under Canning, and a minority government of both Whigs and Tories had to be cobbled together. In the end, the crisis was only resolved when Canning died from tuberculosis after just 119 days in office. George's poor decision-making on this occasion earned him the enmity of the Tories, the party he had leaned towards politically for support in Parliament for the remainder of his reign. This was compounded when the Duke of Wellington finally became Prime Minister early in 1828. George's relationship with the Duke was made worse by the King's insistence that he had fought at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 in disguise and had been integral to the victory in a battle where Wellington had been the British commander. This was clearly a lie, though whether the king was simply trying to rile Wellington by maintaining it, or genuinely thought he could convince people of this, has never been fully resolved. Wellington would outlive George in office. The king was already in very poor health by the late 1820s, plagued by gout, an inflamed bladder, and some have speculated a much milder form of the porphyria, which had most likely been the source of his father's great illness. This was all compounded by his diet and habits, which were primarily centred in the 1820s on large amounts of brandy, port, wine and champagne, meals that mostly consisted of meat, and laudanum on an almost daily basis to sleep. He was clinically obese by this time, and portraits from his later life were doctored to flatter the king, with George often dressed in such a manner as to disguise his weight and his complexion, clearly not resembling the pale and corpulent individual he had become. He died on the 26th of June 1830, at 67 years of age, from what is ultimately understood to have been a ruptured blood vessel which led to major gastrointestinal bleeding. After the standard repose in state and preparations, he was laid to rest in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel at Windsor on the 15th of July 1830, alongside his father. Although George had many biological children, like many other English monarchs before him, they were the product of relationships with women other than his wife. His only legitimate child had sadly died many years before his own passing, and illegitimate children were disbarred from succeeding to the throne. Therefore, his direct line died out as far as the succession was concerned, and he was succeeded by his younger brother as King William IV. William was already 64 years of age when he came to the throne, and was not expected to rule for long in an era where life expectancies were not much more than 70 years for even the most affluent and healthiest in society. Moreover, like his older brother, he did not have children that were legitimate. Thus, when he died 7 years later in 1837, the succession fell to the daughter of his and George's brother, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, who had himself died back in 1820. This was the 18-year-old Victoria. She would rule as Queen Victoria and First Empress of India down to 1901, her name becoming attached to the age in which the country's empire was at its height during her 63 years on the throne. Given how George's short reign was sandwiched in between the enormously long ones of his father and niece, he stood little chance of being remembered by the public for very long. George IV is one of Britain's most obscure monarchs in many ways. Rising to the throne in 1820 when he was already in his late 50s, he ruled for just 10 years, and his reign was dwarfed by the 60-year rule of his father between 1760 and 1820, and his niece's even longer 63-year reign between 1837 and 1901. Furthermore, the 1820s were a period of comparative tranquility in British and European affairs, without any major wars or crises that George might have played a role in resolving. These issues aside, he did have his accomplishments, most notably as a patron of the arts. The 1810s and 1820s, when he was regent and then king, were vibrant decades in terms of English literature. He also, it must be said, stepped up to the mark when he needed to in the 1810s, as his father's final illness became completely debilitating. But it had taken him a very long time to reach maturity. For much of his life, George was a playboy, running up absolutely huge debts through his gambling and lifestyle, and failing to perform his duties as a married prince. He was also unquestionably an alcoholic, though the term did not exist in an age when drinking every day, though not to excess, was considered completely normal. Overall, while he had some accomplishments in the second half of his life, he was no great monarch. Luckily, by that time, Parliament ruled England, not the king. What do you think of King George IV? Was he a trivial king who has rightly been overshadowed by the long reigns of his father, George III, and his niece, Queen Victoria? Or was he a substantial monarch who steadied the ship of state as his father's condition deteriorated? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.